Hey folks, hope you're doing good. Ben here. We are finally breaking free of a super cold, honestly pretty typical for what winter often is. If you go look for the last 100 years around here, just teens, low teens during the day, 0 at night Fahrenheit, just good cold. But it's been windy, super windy every day. We lost a lot of our snow in a second melt, so I haven't been skiing too much, but I've been just getting back out some local logging roads. There's only a couple inches, but it's been, as you can imagine, great logging weather. Managed to pull all of next year's firewood in and then some, a bunch of saw logs too, just in a few hours the other day, and then spent another half day or two and got even more. And so that's been good, and yeah, hope everyone's well. I was inspired with this latest big fire episode in California. Oh, it's so nice to see the sun. We haven't really had any sun in 2 weeks, except for part of one day, and it was blowing, and it's like 15 below with wind chill. And so, the fire apocalypse thing in California, and my condolences and heart goes out to all of you guys who are out there experiencing it or who have friends and family. I actually have a bunch of friends in that area, and a good old friend in Topanga Canyon who's going to sell his house finally, he said, and who almost lost their house. They got lucky and didn't. But they're realizing that, this is just going to keep happening. And also his wife took our permaculture course, and I think that helped her understand that this has always been happening. So I made a couple posts on my Instagram, some stories, to the same effect as I have with flooding here in Vermont, that it's so in vogue lately. And when I say lately, I just mean the last 15 years, to just pin everything on climate change, And I'm someone who's been studying climate change for, I would guess, longer than almost every single one of you guys watching this. 30 years ago, 29 and a half years ago, in 1995, as a junior in high school, I got into climate change through glaciological research, as an academic discipline that I still study and still deal with regularly, because climate is such a huge influence, obviously, on our lives, especially when we are growing food and interacting with land daily and with consequence, as a skier as well. And so I began to study climate change in earnest 30 years ago. It wasn't for about 15 more years that people started using the term climate change, like in the news, and it became what it is now. And for probably starting in the last 5 years, really since Al Gore's stuff, but more so every year. Although I think we're topping out. I think we've hit peak woke. I think we've hit peak climate change hysteria. And you may be watching this thinking, what, climate change hysteria? Ben's first book revision, his original book, was really big on climate change. Like it was this huge impending issue and current issue, because I did emphasize it a lot in my current book, and I de-emphasized it in the revision. Not because climate is less of an issue, of course. Weather over time, which is what climate is, weather patterns over long periods of time, is hugely important. It's the first layer of the scale of permanence. It's the thing you can do nothing about on your site. It's outside your sphere of influence, and it has huge impact on everything you do. And as I said, it's unchanging. So it's the first in the scale of permanence, which, as many of you know, go through ever more changeable components and processes of your place, down to soil, buildings, fences, water. Slope and aspect are really high up. They're like right after climate, because you can't do a whole lot about those things short of major amounts of dynamite. Down to plants, which is lower down and or higher up, depending on which way you look at it, which you can do a whole heck of a lot about. You can level a whole forest pretty quickly with a chainsaw. It's totally in your sphere of influence. So anyway, that's actually what I think we need to talk about more is just that, is our sphere of influence. Our society as a whole has a collective total lack of awareness of the scales of permanence, of the need to focus on that which you actually can do something about. The weather isn't one of those. I'm sorry. I know that may be hard for some people to hear, but you just can't really affect the weather much. Maybe if you're part of a long-standing indigenous group that really has its shit together, dialed in, and you've got some dances and some rituals that can affect the weather. I've seen some potentially strong evidence that Iroquois medicine men and women did functional rain dances, which mattered. I don't know. I'm not a subscriber. I'm totally open to that being possible. But I know I can't affect the weather much within my abilities, and neither can most of you. So I don't want to underestimate most of you, but I think that's probably a safe thing to say. No offense. And but right now, we want to believe that someone else can do a lot about the weather, at least given enough time and money. And I believed that too for a long time, 20 years, probably longer than I'd bet most of you watching this have even had a concern about climate change, if it is a major concern. I felt that way. And I don't feel that way anymore, really for two major reasons. One, it's a very disempowering thing to focus on. Every moment you spend on trying to lobby some corporation or some politician that's in bed with that corporation to change the weather, fight climate change, whatever other inane phrase we come up with. I went up the wrong road. I think I gotta go up this road. Is a moment, a week, a year, whatever, that you don't have to focus on things that you can actually do something about. Focus on things within your sphere of influence. Build soil, make infrastructure, move grazing animals, compost, feed yourself, harvest food, sow seeds. Do things that, interestingly, not only help you in the short term and help your community and the world as a whole, because you're becoming more self-reliant and less dependent on systems that are destructive. Because the way you're going to do that yourself, for the most part, it's going to be much more responsible and ethical than the way it's going to be provided to you by our system. It also, doing those things, also has a positive climate impact if under the idea that carbon emissions are the main thing or the only thing controlling climate, which I don't even care if that's true or not. I've always believed it's true until looking at the Paleoclimate record a lot more in the last 5 years and realizing that carbon dioxide actually doesn't precede temperature change in the Paleoclimate records. It lags behind temperature change. So it's not, how could it be a driver of temperature change if it lags behind? And doesn't come before the changes in Earth's temperature. But I don't even want to get into that because honestly, I don't even care. And I'm not sure. I know a lot of people are sure carbon dioxide is the driver, the main driver, or a huge driver, along with sunspots, Milankovitch cycles, and all the other, kind of geological, cosmological interactions. Or it's really a drop in the bucket compared to just a bunch of volcanic eruptions, which sometimes kind of happen episodically around the world. And that obviously affects temperatures. We know that. I think that's indisputable. But that could be because of just direct, particulate pollution and its effect on the albedo, the reflectivity of our atmosphere, and versus the absorption. So it may or may not be carbon dioxide based. But again, I don't even care. I just care about how I spend my time and whether it's actually going to result in something positive. And so the interesting thing is, even if you're really big on we need to fix the climate's broken, quote unquote, fight climate change, all these other, honestly, wacky ideas, because you can't fight climate change anymore. You can fight plate tectonics. I have a friend who has a fight plate tectonics, stop plate tectonics t-shirt. It's great. Stop plate tectonics. Just it's kind of poking fun at and highlighting, just to try to engage in something that's out of your sphere of influence wildly, like Don Quixote, fighting windmills kind of thing. Even way more than that, obviously. So nothing you're going to do, nothing I'm going to do is going to change the weather, probably, or at least not much. But everything we do can affect a whole host of other very meaningful things in our life, and then thus influence the collective for the better, including sequester carbon. So I put on my Instagram that what we always like to blame on land use, on climate change, droughts, wildfire disasters, floods in Vermont, erosion, you name it. Really cold weather, they blame on climate change now. Really hot weather, really windy weather. All of that has been happening since not only before the Industrial Revolution, we started spewing all this carbon, ancient carbon, out of the ground, which, don't get me wrong, I think is a bad idea, just on principle. The earth has stored all of this old sunshine in the form of dead plants and animals. You probably should leave it there. Okay, I don't know anyone who disagrees with that, who thinks it's a good thing to dredge it all out. And I think pulling it all out of the ground at major scale has to do something. Of course, it's pollution. It's not good to breathe in. Maybe it affects the climate a lot. Again, that's neither here nor there in terms of what you do in your daily life. But the things you do in your daily life have the most potential to actually sequester carbon. How you live your life has a huge effect on how carbon negative or positive you are, if you think that's such a major issue. And again, I did for a long time, 30 years, and I still kind of do. But I really don't focus on it much anymore because I know, I've come to think that politicians, corporate leaders, and their policies just aren't going to affect the weather. There's, even if things shifted massively, we're going to substitute one problem for another. So, okay, we made the entire fleet from oil to fossil minerals, which is what electricity is, because to store electricity we have to use fossil minerals in the current scheme, unless we go hydrogen, which I don't know where that went. So it depends on dredging out the cobalt from the ocean seabeds and ecosystems that have never been touched directly by man, causing a whole host of brand new ecological catastrophes to, quote unquote, fix the current ecological catastrophe. It's not none of these things are solutions, right? At best, they're just stop causing one issue and cause a whole bunch of new ones, or slow down causing one issue, maybe, and definitely cause new terrible issues. But let's just focus on, it's a cool spot. It's still diamond dusting. It's cold enough, but I think hopefully the weather's finally breaking to be more mild. Let's just focus on the California fires is this example that has spawned this. Fires like that just happened and are still happening, guaranteed have happened before. I just heard a weather expert in Southern California on the radio. He's like, well, we've only seen winds like this a couple times in the last 25 years. 25 years. Okay. Go back 2,500 years. Go back 25,000 years. Go back 250,000 years. Guaranteed fires of this like intense Santa Ana events happen. The floods we've seen in Vermont that are, some people have called unprecedented, they've happened before. They've happened recently. Read town history maps, or town history books. One of the ones I read recently was the history of Lincoln, Vermont. Lincoln basically wiped off the map once and almost twice in the early 1800s. Was that climate change? Crazy ass weather events, like in the early 1900s, like Chicago was like 100 and way over 100 degrees, and like lots of people died. Obviously they didn't have electric air conditioning as much then, but like it was way worse than anything we've had in the last 50 years. Was that climate change? Like you can just look into the even recent, like last 200 years historical record, and the weather's done insane stuff. The Dust Bowl, I know I don't hear people calling the Dust Bowl climate change, AGW. So all this stuff's been happening forever. Is it whether it's happening like a little more now or a lot more now, somewhat inconsequential again, because it's outside your sphere of influence. But here's the kicker. There are so many things inside your sphere of influence. So land use, which to me is the catch-all source of all these issues, developing the heck out of Southern California and putting millions of people in a really volatile place between the ocean and the hills, in a place that historically gets insane fire pressures. Well, that was our decision. That was what humans decided to do. Many people don't have to be part of that. They could live somewhere else. Not everyone. Don't get me wrong. I feel especially bad for the people who economically, are stuck there. The suppression, lack of suppression of fires, lack of frequent burning, low grade, low intensity, high frequency fuels burning by indigenous people, which is how California was managed more intensely than almost anywhere else on the planet, as far as we can tell, with fire. often yearly burns over much of the landscape, keeping fuels down. And it also, of course, had a lot of other benefits to the Sierra Miwok and other peoples who have inhabited that area for thousands and thousands of years. Read Tending the Wild. Maybe one of the main things you'll come away from the history of indigenous land management by M. Cat Anderson in California is a view that they burned everything all the time. Like, that's kind of the cliff notes in some ways of that book, and they lived on acorns. It's deeper than that, of course, but that is like so central. So we've done that. We've removed indigenous people and their management systems, which were informed by thousands of years of experience, were brilliant and intelligent beyond our ability, probably beyond our ability to even understand right now, and more nuanced. There are people engaging with that again, and trying to reintroduce those things. Don't get me wrong. People like Connor Jones and other people in Southern California, permaculture people. Eric, blanking on his last name, but Stacking Functions. Just anyone experienced in good land management, regenerative land management, this is not news to. But I'm speaking to everyone else who, unfortunately, is most people. I was talking to my parents the other day, and they're like, look at what climate change did to California. I was like, well, what about land use? And I started explaining to them these things. And they're like, oh, wow, that's interesting. They're like, that's not on the news, Like, yeah, it doesn't fit in a soundbite. And it's systemic, not discrete. So, yeah, those are some of the big ones. Just our settlement patterns, our lack of use of fuels, and in some ways our lack of land use itself. Heavy abusive land use in a lot of ways in terms of how we pave over and build on, but not how we actually cycle nutrients and carbon. How essentially the lack of megafauna, the lack of grazing impact being a huge one. So fuels have built up and become, even more catastrophic. But we can even put all that aside and say, look, even 3,500 years ago, and the Yokuts and the Miwoks and the different dozens of groups occupy California, and especially those in Southern California. There's a great map in M. Cat Anderson's book. There were still probably, almost undoubtedly, like majorly catastrophic fires, just like this, maybe worse. And people moved away from them. They were nimble and agile. They didn't create settlements that were so permanent. Obviously, more rebuildable, much more mobile. In general, this is true across, most indigenous groups, just technologically. And they could come back in after, and it wasn't as catastrophic to their culture. And although I'm sure it was to some extent here and there, there's kind of no one's saying that the earth isn't just a catastrophic place. Weather-wise, like, she does catastrophic things. There is no mercy in natural systems. I every now and then watch Oren Lyon's speech about climate change at the UN. He goes through that in a very concise way. There's no mercy in nature. There's just law. It's just you do, and then you have consequence. And so we did the way we did in Southern California, and this is a consequence. And that's enough. And the reason I think I'm focused on this, because you may say, okay, well then what's the point of talking about this? The point is what I've already mentioned. I want to recap that, which is we can do a lot of good things if we focus on what's in our sphere of influence. And I don't think focusing on trying to convince a system which is inherently structured to centralize power and be abusive to people and land to do something that it wasn't designed to do. In fact, do something in the antithesis of what it was designed to do, is just a very productive use of our time and energy. And that's, you could disagree, and that's fine. I felt that way. I did a lot of sign waving and writing letters and protesting. And then I found permaculture back in 1997, 98. And in the first few pages of Bill Mollison's Black Book, that's what clicked for me and so many other people, was that, well, I don't want to just waste my time. I mean, I can blow up a bulldozer and then they'll bring another bulldozer. And I'm not saying I don't appreciate direct action and activism. I do. I still do it. We've stopped chemical spraying in my valley because of a project I started and ran, because I got all activistic again. And same with other issues since then. Also where I live, we've stopped other industrial developments because of direct activism. Not direct action, but just working with legislators and communities to speak up. That's awesome. Totally. We have to do that, especially locally. But what I see happening, especially among certain demographics, is just this defaulting to climate change, quote unquote, throwing up our hands like Gavin Newsom literally did when he was interviewed in front of the fires, threw up his arms in this disempowered way of like, well, someone else has to fix it. And obviously that's catastrophic. And there's something deeper too. I'm just gonna stop in the sun here, which is that I think this carbon centrism, carbon myopia, people are calling it, is also rooted in what we've seen, which I've already talked about with the pandemic and the rise of Trump and all this, which is this very strong feeling of like the other enemy, the bad people out there doing bad things. The billionaires did this. Hey, I don't have a particular love for billionaires any more than I have a particular love for poor people or millionaires or just regular middle class people, whatever, you know. I don't think there should be billionaires ideally, but there is, and it doesn't mean all those people are bad and they're all causing this problem. It's the system, right, that's wrong, and we have to work within our sphere of influence to affect the system. I think one of the things that's driving this, what I see is like essentially a very religious response around climate change. And when you suggest something's not climate change, people get really triggered, which reveals this. We may see that in the comments here. What do you mean it's not climate change? Are you a climate denier? All these things. And that reveals this zealotry, this like emotional attachment to a belief. That's when we have these triggering reflexes. We all have them. I have them sometimes. I try to interrogate what's really going on when I have that triggering response, because it belies some like belief, some dogma there, that some inflexibility in terms of my belief system. And we see that in climate. You know, I've heard people for years now call like the climate change people like a cult, like the climate cult. And I was like, no, it's not. You know, people are just trying to like do good work and fight pollution and all this stuff. And I have come to realize that in a lot of ways those people were right. There is this, it's like there's a strong belief system and reactivity, which I think is blowback, which so much of what we experience today is blowback, you know, about anything. Like we see that with the pandemic and with like health, public health, we see that massively. There's few people that are really like truly anti-wax, but like the go-to thing for a lot of people is to call someone anti-wax. When they're always like, hey, I'm just critical of like this and that, or I want to ask questions about this and I want to learn more about this, and I'm skeptical about this. It's like, that's blowback, right? That's not, because they're not responding to actually what those people are saying. They're responding to their perception of a worsened of the worst version of that person in their mind, right? Straw manning, and it's otherizing. And I think that happens a lot in climate, in the whole climate thing too, of saying, oh, if you think there's other things going on, then it's just being climate change caused by all the big bad forces that I believe in, then you're one of those bad people too, potentially. Like you're on the other side, right? You're an enemy. And that is like super, super dangerous, because what that does, as we've already seen, is make the alternative to that narrative always acceptable. Like, okay, like anything that's not Trump is fine. And that's what happened with Biden for 4 years. And it didn't work. After 4 years of that, people were like, whoa, that's not a viable policy. Be like, the opposite of Trump is good, is passable, is fine. We'll ignore the really egregious parts of it. You know, that's a very short-term Band-Aid, and it doesn't work. And it leads to like hellacious places and hellacious policies and hellacious actions between people. And I've talked about that in my last couple of videos. And so to me, that's in some ways like the real issue here, is the dogma around it. And yeah, so anyway, I hope you guys are well. And hopefully we have a turn in it's been a really nice winter. Not so much snow, but it would be sweet if we stop ripping through wood. It's been so cold, and just get some sun. And also the days are getting longer. To me, that's the hardest part about winter, is just the super short days. And they're finally lengthening. And all of us, including Stella, little kicker, is just relishing the light returning. And I hope you guys are as well. And prayers to all of you dealing with this crazy event down in SoCal and wherever it will be next, because there'll be more. And encourage people to think about resilience in the long term, medium and long term, setting up shop in places that aren't catastrophe prone, because a lot of the earth just is. It's just how it is. And then a lot of the earth isn't. I mean, here in Vermont, we get floods, but it affects like 1% of the landscape is flooded. It's just not. Doesn't affect 99% of these hills in a bad way, for the most part. It's just whereas, fires, hurricanes. So imagine living in Florida, southern Florida, tough one. You can't do much about that. I mean, you could do some things, but you can't do much about the influence on everyone else who isn't doing much about it, and then that affects you. So, yeah, hope you guys are good, and lots of love, and yeah, we'll see ya.